How Theosophy Came to Me by C.W. Leadbeater, Chapter 7, Our Voyage to India. Our interesting stay in Cairo was brought to an end by the news that our steamer, the British India SS Navarino, was due at Port Said on a certain date. Thither I was dispatched as a kind of avant-courier to make arrangements in advance of some special comforts for Madame Blavatsky, who, with the rest of our little party, wished to avoid the canal, to have an extra day in Cairo, and to embark at Suez. The small errand I duly accomplished, and I think our leader was well satisfied with the accommodation provided, though of course it fell short of the luxury of the larger modern vessels. We had a full complement of passengers, and I suppose that both they and the officers were about the average crowd that one expects to meet on board an eastern-bound boat. The captain was perhaps a trifle unusual, for he was a very religious man, narrow and puritanical, and he not unnaturally regarded Madame with a stern disapproval which seemed strongly tinged with horror. His attitude towards our party was one of icy reserve, and during the whole voyage none of us exchanged more than very few words with him. His officers, however, were more amenable, and I remember that Mrs. Oakley, who was an indefatigable propagandist, made friends with the third mate, Mr. Voyage, and succeeded in interesting him in theosophy to some small extent, at any rate sufficiently to induce him to read one or two books, to attend one of our meetings at Adyar, and I think to correspond with her later. Among the passengers were several missionaries, and they, with one exception, seemed distinctly disposed to regard us as emissaries of the Prince of Darkness. The exception was a young Wesleyan minister named Restorick, R-E-S-T-O-R-I-C-K, with whom I used to play deck tennis. I found him quite friendly and reasonable, and willing to discuss without acrimony all kinds of religious matters. A very different type was an earnest, but quite uneducated missionary from America, named Daniel Smith, who made no secret of the fact that he had been a bricklayer, but found the hard work and the exposure too severe for his health, and so, as he put it, the Lord had called him to preach the gospel to the heathen. Perhaps because of his ignorance he was apt to be aggressive, and used frequently to engage in arguments with Madame Blavatsky, which were a source of great amusement to the passengers. I'm afraid that our leader took a kind of impish pleasure in entangling him in this talk, and inducing him to commit himself to the most impossible theological statements. She knew the Bible far better than he did, and would constantly quote unexpected and little-known texts, which drew from him the indignant protest, "That's not in the Bible. I'm sure that's not in the Bible." Then Mrs. Blavatsky would turn to me with deadly composure. "Leadbeater, fetch my Bible from my cabin," and would proceed to confound him with chapter and verse. Once he was so ill-advised as to rejoin, "Well, anyhow, I'm sure it's not in my copy." But the ripple of amusement which ran round the audience warned him to avoid such a rash assertion in the future. As we were crossing the Indian Ocean, I remember walking the deck with Madame Blavatsky early one morning in all the glory of a tropical sunrise, when this worthy missionary appeared at the top of the staircase, and she at once hailed him with the words, "Now, Mr. Smith, look around you. See the calm, shining sea and the lovely colors. See how good your God is. Surely on such a glorious morning as this, you can't tell me that I'm going to be burnt in hell forever and ever." I must do the Reverend Daniel the justice to admit that he blushed deeply and looked very uncomfortable, but he stuck manfully to his guns and replied with a very evident effort, "Well, I'm very sorry, ma'am, but I guess you will." Naturally, Madame Blavatsky's brilliant and powerful personality impressed itself upon the whole company, officers and passengers alike, always excepting the captain, and whenever she chose to show herself upon deck in good weather, she speedily gathered around her a kind of court of interested auditors who asked her questions upon all sorts of subjects and listened fascinated to her stories of experience and adventure in out-of-the-way corners of the world. At night especially, they asked always for tales of the weird and supernatural, which she told so well and with such gruesome realism that her audience shuddered with delightful thrills of horror. But I noticed that they had a distinct tendency to herd together afterwards, and that none would adventure into a dark passage alone. The Navarino was not exactly an ocean greyhound, but at long last we reached Colombo, where Colonel Olcott met us and introduced me to the leading members of the Buddhist Theosophical Society there. It was a previous generation of workers, and I suppose hardly any of the Sinhalese gentlemen who were prominent among them are still upholding the Society's flag on a physical plane. I remember especially the old Mohandiran, in brackets, an importable city official, Mr. William de Abreu, A-B-R-E-W, in brackets, father of the well-known Mr. Peter de Abreu, who had worked so loyally for us for so many years. Mr. Don Carolus of Mutwal, M-U-T-W-A-L, Mr. J.R. de Silva, whom for some reason the colonel always nicknamed the doctor, though this was not his profession, Mr. C.P. Ganawaranda, G-U-N-A-W-A-R-D-A-N-A, then the secretary of our Colombo branch, Mr. N.S. Fernando, Mr. Wijasikara, W-I-J-I-A-S-E-K-A-R-A, Mr. Hendrik de Silva, and others whose names elude me now, though their faces are still clear in my mind's eye. After all, it is 46 years ago, more than half of a long lifetime. Most important of all, I was presented to the great Buddhist leader and scholar Hikadue Sumangala Thero, High Priest of the Peak and of Gale, G-A-L-L-E, and principal of the Vidyodhaya Monks' College at Maradana, the most learned and highly respected of the leaders of the Southern Church of Buddhism. And I'm going to spell his name here because I'm sure I mispronounced it. Hikkaduwe Sumangala Thero. On an earlier visit to the lovely island of Ceylon, both Colonel Olcott and Madame Blavatsky had made public profession of the Buddhist faith and had been formally received into that religion, and now Madame Blavatsky asked me whether I was willing to follow their example in that respect. She strongly impressed upon me that if I took that step, it must be entirely of my own motion and on my own responsibility, and that she had no wish to persuade me in the matter, but she thought that, as I was a Christian priest, the open acceptance of a great Oriental religion would go far to convince both Hindus and Buddhists of my bona fides and would enable me to be far more useful in working among them for our masters. I replied that I felt the very greatest reverence for the Lord Buddha, and wholeheartedly accepted his teaching, and that I should feel it a great honor to enroll myself among his followers, if I could do so without abjuring the Christian faith into which I had been baptized. She assured me that no such repudiation would be asked of me, and that there was no incompatibility between Buddhism and true Christianity, though no enlightened Buddhist would be likely to credit the crude theological dogmas which were usually preached by the missionaries. Buddhism, she said, was not a question of creed, but of life. I was not asked to accept any article of faith, but to try to live according to the precepts of the Lord. To this, I was, of course, entirely agreeable, and so it was arranged that I should be presented to the high priest for admission. That very title of high priest is something of a misnomer, though it was universally employed among us in speaking of Sumangala. In strict accuracy, some such title as chief abbot would have come nearer the truth. There is, in reality, nothing like a priesthood in Buddhism. There is no sacrifice to be offered, no public service to be led. The brethren of the yellow robe, who are so picturesque, a feature of the life of all Buddhist countries, are best described as monks. And the nearest they come to leading a public service is when they, in quotes, give pansil, Pansil, as it is called, to such of their people as ask for it. That is to say, they recite in Pali the sacred formula of the 3 refuges and the 5 precepts by which all Buddhists are supposed to govern their lives, and the people obediently repeat the pledges which are dictated to them. It is the recitation of this very same formula which constitutes the solemn admission to the Buddhist religion. It was this, therefore, that I had to repeat after the high priest that day in the garden of his college. It is straightforward and simple, but far-reaching. We may say that it opens with an ascription of praise to the Lord Buddha. I reverence the Blessed One, the Holy One, the Perfect in wisdom. The next section is entitled The 3 Refuges. Refuges. This is repeated thrice, and then follows the Tisarana, commonly rendered the 3 refuges. That expression is, however, not an exact equivalent of the Pali word, which seems to mean much more nearly a guide. The nearest that we can come in English to the true meaning of this declaration is, I take the Lord Buddha as my guide. I take his law as my guide. I take his order as my guide. The word Dhamma, Dhamma, in brackets, Sanskrit, Dharma, Dharma, is usually translated law, Law, really bears a much wider significance than that English term. It is not in the least a law of a series of commandments ordained by the Lord Buddha. It is his statement of the universal laws under which the universe exists, and consequently of the duties of men as part of that mighty scheme. It is in this sense that the expressions quoted above are employed by the Buddhist. In pronouncing the Tisarana, he expresses the acceptance of Lord Buddha as his guide and teacher, his adherence to the doctrine which the Buddha taught, and his recognition of the great order of Buddhist monks as the practiced interpreters of the meaning of that doctrine. This does not in the least imply the acceptance of the interpretation of any particular monk, but only that of the order in the most Catholic sense. He believes that interpretation to be accurate, which is held by the entire brotherhood in all places and all times, thus closely approximating to the great Catholic declaration that only should be believed which has been accepted, semper, S-E-M-P-E-R. And then there's a French phrase, ubique et ab omnibus. And I'm going to spell this, U-B-I-Q-U-E-E-T-A-B O-M-N-I-B-U-S. Always, everywhere, and by everyone. But it would seem that in some cases, at least a much wider connotation is attached to this idea of brotherhood, so that it is taken to include not only the order as now existing in the physical plane, but the whole order from the beginning, corresponding to the Christian theory of the communion of saints, perhaps even to the great white brotherhood itself. The next section here is called the 5 Precepts. Following immediately upon this declaration, the Panchasila, P-A-N-C-H-A-S-I-L-A, commonly called the 5 Precepts, are recited. Again, precepts is hardly the right word, although it is a possible translation of sila, S-I-L-A. Pledges comes much closer to the fact, although hardly permissible as a translation. These are often compared to the 10 Commandments of Judaism, but in reality they differ greatly in character, and though fewer in number, are much more comprehensive. And they are as follows. 1. Observe the precept to refrain from destruction of life. Oh, let me start that over again. Number 1. I observe the precept to refrain from destruction of life. Number 2. I observe the precept to refrain from taking that which is not mine. Number 3. I observe the precept to refrain from unlawful sexual intercourse. 4. I observe the precept to refrain from falsehood. Number 5. I observe the precept to refrain from using intoxicating liquors or stupefying drugs. It can hardly fail to strike the intelligent person that, as Colonel Alcott writes, quote, one who observes these strictly must escape from every cause productive of human misery. For if we study history, we shall find that it is all sprung from one or another of these causes. The far-seeing wisdom of the Lord Buddha is most plainly shown in the 1st, 3rd, and 5th. For the taking of life, sensuality, and the use of intoxicants cause at least 95% of the suffering among men. It is interesting to notice how each of these precepts goes further than the corresponding Jewish commandment. Instead of being told to do no murder, we find ourselves enjoined to take no life, whatever. Instead of being commanded not to steal, we have the far-reaching precept not to take that which does not belong to us, which would obviously cover the acceptance of praise not honestly due to us, and many another case quite outside of what is commonly called stealing. It will be observed also that the third of these precepts includes a great deal more than the seventh of the commandments of Moses, forbidding not only one particular type of unlawful intercourse, but all types. Instead of being forbidden to bear false witness in a court of law, we are enjoined to avoid falsehood altogether. I have often thought, what a good thing it would have been for all these European countries which have taken up the teachings of Christ if the legendary Moses had included in his Decalogue the fifth of the Buddhist precepts, the introduction to touch no intoxicating liquor nor stupefying drugs. How much simpler would be all our essential problems if that commandment were observed in England and America as it is observed in the Buddhist countries. It is also very characteristic of the Buddhist faith that there is here no commandment, thou shalt not do this or that, no order given by a deity or a teacher, but simply the quiet promise made by each man that he will refrain from certain actions which are obviously undesirable. This, then, as I have said, is the formula which I had to recite after the high priest Samangala, and at the same time he gave me a short explanation of it and what it implied. I remember also that before admitting me, he asked me whether I fully understood the religion into which I had been born, pointing out that such birth was not by chance, and that I ought to be sure that I had duly learnt such lessons as it had to teach. Even on this occasion of my first introduction to him, I was much impressed by the nobility, the courtesy, and the obvious fairness of the high priest. One felt at once that one was in the presence of a truly great man. I came to know much more of him later, as I was engaged for some years in educational work in Ceylon, and I always found him erudite, able, and kindly, and not without a saving sense of humor. Though it does not belong at this stage of my story, but to a period perhaps 2 years later, I will include at this point a little incident which seems somewhat characteristic of him. As the Vidyodaya College was not very far from what was then the principal railroad station in Colombo, and well within reach of this stream of sightseers who landed from the great mail steamers, the high priest had quite a number of European visitors, and more especially those who were interested in Oriental religions made a point of calling upon him. I remember, for instance, that on one occasion the professor of Sanskrit from a great European university appeared on the scene, and some Mangala joyously hailed him with a speech of welcome in Sanskrit, but was much surprised to find that the learned professor could not understand a word of it, since he had apparently never regarded Sanskrit as a spoken language at all. On the other hand, when Sir Edwin Arnold came to Colombo, he received a princely ovation, and in that case there was no disappointment, for he was not only able to understand and appreciate the loving welcome extended to him, but to reply in it in a long and fluent Sanskrit speech. The special incident to which I have referred was of a slightly different character. In this case, the visitor was a French scientist of considerable eminence who came to see the chief abbot, perhaps mainly out of curiosity, or perhaps to show courtesy to a learned man of whom he had heard something in Europe. This gentleman spoke with respect of the philosophy of the Lord Buddha, but deplored the fact that he had sometimes made indefensible statements on scientific subjects. The high priest asked him to give an instance, and the Frenchman quoted an assertion that the earth rested upon water, the water in turn upon air, and the air upon empty space. Sumangala listened most politely and said that he was, of course, fully aware of the wonderful discoveries of Western science and was always very glad to learn anything that he could of them. But then he quite innocently inquired from the scientist what were the latest conclusions on that subject from the European point of view. And he said, "Now, if it were possible for us to bore straight down under our feet as we sit here, clear through to the other side of the earth, what should we find at the other end of that hole?" The scientist considered it for a few minutes, and he replied, "Calculating roughly, I think we would come out in the Pacific Ocean." "Yes," said the chief abbot with keen interest, "and if we carried on through the ocean, what would we find next?" "Well, of course, we would come out into the atmosphere. And if we pushed on through the atmosphere, well, then we should arrive in interplanetary space." "Then," said Sumangala meekly, "it seems that the conclusions of modern science do not, after all, differ greatly from those of the Lord Buddha." After a day or two in Colombo, we resumed our voyage on the Navarino and duly arrived at Madras to find an uncomfortably heavy swell, which made our landing a distinctly unpleasant and even somewhat hazardous business. A breakwater had been erected some years previously and had not proved strong enough to resist the seas raised by the monsoon, so that all that was left of it were a few scattered heaps of stone. Consequently, we had to be taken off the ship in enormous boats of a very unusual type, the planks of which were constructed seemed not to be nailed together in the ordinary way, but, as it were, stitched together with a rope, so that there was a curious collapsibility about the sides, and we were told that this method of construction enabled them to resist the impact of the tremendous surf better than if they had been more rigid. The boats were of great depth, and the rowers, with their long paddles, perched themselves somehow on the sides, the very gunwale of the boat, while the unfortunate passengers were dumped into the central hollow, far below the feet of the rowers, in what would have been the hold of the craft if it had been decked. It will perhaps be understood that to descend into such a craft from a steamer which is rolling heavily in the open roads, for of course there was nothing like a harbor, required great agility, and was indeed a decidedly dangerous feat, as the boat was sometimes level for a moment with the ship's bulwarks, and directly afterwards 20 or 30 feet below, for the seas were positively mountainous. One had to jump at exactly the right moment, and one by one most of the passengers achieved it, although with a great deal of trepidation, mostly bundling ungracefully and ignominiously into the bottom of the boat. Obviously, gymnastics of this sort were impossible for Madame Blavatsky, and the only alternative was to tie her carefully into a chair and lower her by means of an ordinary cargo winch. I need hardly say that she did not appreciate this operation, and I think that her language on the occasion rather surprised even the hardened officers. She was, however, lowered and received with perfect safety, and though the process may have appeared undignified, I think some of the rest of us rather envied her. Presently we were all safely in the boat, very wet but otherwise uninjured. We have to remember that Madame Blavatsky was returning to India to meet a mass of most wicked and slanderous charges which had been brought against her by the Madras Christian College missionaries, that these so-called missionaries had confidently predicted that she would never return to face these charges, and that consequently the Indian population regarded her as a hero and a martyr, and came down in their thousands to give her such an ovation as might have been accorded to a victorious general. The students of Pachiapa's college were taking a very prominent part in the reception, apparently as a demonstration against the rival Madras Christian College, and it may have been they who were responsible for the appearance of a band of performers upon various weird Indian musical instruments, mostly, so far as I can remember, or the flute or flageolet, Flageolet, order, though there were also some drums. Whoever was in charge of the proceedings made the fatal mistake of sending this band out to the ship in that terrible Masuli boat, Masuli boat. And as they were tossing about for at least 20 minutes in that boat, in a very high sea, while arrangements were being made to put Madame Blavatsky and other passengers on board, they were absolutely prostrate with seasickness, and instead of receiving our leader with joyous strains as her chair swung down, they were simply lying, groaning and helpless in the bottom of the boat. We were brought alongside a pier on which we landed only with very great difficulty. In fact, some members of the band had to be lifted on shore by their friends. Along that pier ran a rail tramway line, and there was a single and rather primitive car, which under ordinary circumstances was drawn by a horse. But about a dozen of the most enthusiastic students had harnessed themselves to this car and insisted on drawing Madame Blavatsky to the shore in triumph amidst a huge cheering crowd. Quite a number of Europeans had also come down to see the fun and were seated in their carriages at the end of the pier. I think that the Oakleys felt distinctly conspicuous and uncomfortable, and I must admit that I was a little embarrassed myself, as the whole proceeding was, to say the least of it, unconventional. But Madame Blavatsky accepted all this homage with great dignity as a matter of course, and indeed seemed rather to enjoy it. A comical touch was added to the scene by the fact that the unhappy bandsmen, still desperately in the throes of mal de mer, mal-de-mer, were marshaled in front of the car and instructed to walk backwards before it, not only playing hard all the time, but bowing towards the car as they walked. Words fail to describe what an amazing pageant. If the reader's imagination is sufficiently powerful, he can perhaps make a mental picture of those heroic bandsmen, still green and staggering from seasickness, walking or rather stumbling backwards, bowing profoundly and constantly, but struggling nobly to bring out a few notes from their various instruments between the spasms of acute discomfort. And this weird procession tunneling its way through a closely packed and wildly uproarious crowd, all waving flags and yelling at the top of their voices. That pier seemed very, very long, and at last we reached the shoreward end, and we found that some sympathetic Maharaja had sent down a carriage to meet Madame and to carry her off to Pachiapapa's hall, where she was to receive an address of welcome from the students. We were hustled onto a platform at Pachiapa's hall, where Colonel Alcott and Madame Blavatsky were accommodated with 2 big armchairs. The hall was crowded to excess, and the tumultuous cheering made it quite impossible to speak for many minutes. Of course, we were all loaded with garlands, according to the kindly and picturesque Indian custom, and an attempt was made to read the address of welcome, though irrepressible outbursts of cheering made it difficult to follow. Then the colonel rose to reply on Madame Blavatsky's behalf, and one might have hoped that his speech would be allowed to terminate the proceedings. But there were many other Indian brothers who wished to express their sympathy and their flaming indignation at the atrocious wickedness of the missionaries. There was an insistent demand for a speech from Madame Blavatsky herself, and although she did not usually speak in public, she at last consented to do so on this especial occasion. Naturally, she was received with thunders of applause, which lasted so long that she had to sit down again and wait until it was all over. When at last she was allowed to speak, she began very well by saying how touched she was by this enthusiastic reception, and how it showed her what she had always known, that the people of India would not accept tamely these vile, cowardly, loathsome, and utterly abominable slanders circulated by these unspeakable. But here she became so vigorously adjectival that the colonel hurriedly intervened and somehow persuaded her to resume her seat, while he called upon an Indian member to offer a few remarks. I remember especially an exceedingly brilliant speech made by a young lawyer, Mr. Gyanendra Chakravarti. I'm going to spell that name. Gyanendranath. Chakravarti. I had previously no idea whatever of the eloquence and faultless diction of this highly educated Indian speaker. The proceedings at Pachipapa's hall seemed to me almost interminable, but eventually we were allowed to depart for Adyar, and I had my first glimpse of the headquarters, which I afterwards came to know so well, which even now seems to me more truly home than any other spot in the world. Here, of course, was yet another reception for Madame Blavatsky, and I think that even her iron determination must by this time have been approaching its limit, for the rest of us were almost too exhausted to be able to appreciate the wonderful scene. And that concludes Chapter 7.